Well, we'll just start first and foremost. The world is bearing eyewitness to the death of a nation, and it's tragic. The death of Ukraine, and it's just going to get worse. There's nothing the Ukrainian government can do to stabilize the situation. The Russian attacks, if they continue, again, I'm not a targeteer for the Russians, so I can't tell you what they're going to do. But logic implies that they're going to continue a strategic air campaign that's having an extraordinarily detrimental impact on the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian morale, and Ukrainian ability to sustain resistance. So, we're seeing this part. Then on the battlefield, just a quick correction: they're not Russian conscripts. These are reservists. These are people who served. So it's not like you're taking some kid off the street who's never served. You're taking guys who have done a full term of contract service between 4 and 6 years, and they've received refresher training depending on how long they've been out of service. Around 87,000 of them have already been rolled up into the forces on the ground. They are plugging gaps in the defense. They've solidified the defensive line. There are no more Ukrainian breakthroughs, and there's just a lot of dead Ukrainians, dead Poles, dead mercenaries.
Let me stop you. Dead Poles. Are there Polish troops on the ground in Ukraine fighting with the Ukrainians against the Russians?
Tens of thousands. And thousands have died.
Wow. And that has not triggered anything from the rest of NATO by way of troops on the ground?
No, because the Poles aren't there as Polish troops. They're there. They've been in the United States, we call it sheep dipped, meaning they basically take off their Polish uniforms, they get dipped in Ukrainian uniforms, and then they go forward. But they fight as Polish units. I interviewed a senior Russian commander, actually a Chechen, Opti Adula. I'm going to butcher his last name, but he said, look, he's in the Lugansk front. He says, we used to, we listen to the chatter all the time, the radio traffic. He said, where we used to hear Ukrainian voices, all we hear now is French, English, and Polish. That's all we hear. Polish. And the dead bodies are just piling up. Poles have acknowledged so far over 1,000 bodies have been returned to Poland. It's becoming a problem because the Polish people are starting to ask questions. Why so many dead Poles? Are we at war? Imagine America engaged in a conflict that we weren't being honest with the American people, and 1,000 bodies came home.
What other country has troops on the ground wearing Ukrainian uniforms besides Poland?
Romania. There's a lot of Romanian troops that are there, Polish troops. And both those, I believe, those are part of official policies, meaning that the Romanian government and the Polish government have an official policy where active duty soldiers can be sheep dipped and turned into Ukrainian soldiers on a voluntary basis. But then we have, literally hundreds, if not thousands, of French, British, Canadian, American citizens, people with prior military experience, who are in Ukraine on U.S. government-funded contracts. They're private military contractors, and their money's coming from the U.S. government. And we're at war. We are at war.
Why is it that the Polish government doesn't see the futility of this? I can understand the Ukrainians wanting to fight to the bitter end. They have hope. It's not much of hope, but they have hope. But what's in it for the Poles? Don't they see that Russia is going to prevail? And don't they see that they're just wasting innocent lives and material?
I can't speak for the Poles, but I try to put myself in their shoes and find some sort of logic. And here's the logic that I can come up with. The Poles at some point in time are going to make a play for Western Ukraine, for Lvov and other territories and cities that used to be Poland back before 1939. And in order to do that, the Polish army has zero combat experience, zero. It's a conscript military. They're not professionals. And what Poland's doing right now is getting a crash course in combat readiness. They're sending troops in. They're being blooded on the battlefield. They're learning to fight Russians. They're learning about Russian tactics, etc. And when the time comes, these troops will be pulled out of the front, sent to Western Ukraine, and they're already there. They're not going to be crossing the border from Poland into Ukraine. They're already in Ukraine, and they can.
So you're suggesting that part of the reason for the Polish presence, or maybe the principal reason for the Polish military presence in Ukraine, is to occupy the western portion of it once the Russians leave. Is that a fair summary of what you just said?
Yeah, it's the only logic I can find, because otherwise you're just sacrificing troops for no reason. There's no reason to send your troops into eastern Ukraine where they're literally being slaughtered. Yes, they're getting combat experience, but they're being slaughtered by the Russians. The only reason I can see to do this is that you're blooding them, you're getting combat experience, and you will have the troops on the ground already when the time comes to convert back to being Polish controlled.
How professional has the Russian military become? I mean, my understanding is that before this war, the Russian military was essentially defensive and prepared for defensive incursions by NATO. Now, this is a major offensive incursion by the Russian military. Has this changed the Russian military at all? I mean, stated differently, has American military aid to Ukraine actually made the Russians better fighters?
Yeah, look, Russia up until 2008 was, as you said, primarily a defensive organization, especially when it came to Europe. They had decommissioned their tank armies, their combined armed army. They were primarily a brigade type force where you had brigades that could go do small wars here or there. The war with Georgia was an eye opener for them, because these Russians went up against Georgian infantry that were trained by Marines. Now, I'm bragging a little bit here, but the Marines trained them well. And the Russians were U.S. Marines. We trained the Georgians, so we trained the Georgian brigade, and they performed outstandingly in terms of the small unit tactics, maneuver, communications, things that make infantry units look and act professionally. The Georgians were doing. The problem is they didn't have any heavy artillery or tanks, and the Russians just steamrolled them down. You could be good infantry, but if you aren't backed up with nice artillery and tanks, you're going to get rolled. And the Georgians got rolled, but the Russians took a lesson from that, saying qualitatively, man for man, the Georgians were better than the Russians. And that means that NATO's better than the Russians. And they said, we have to change that. So from 2008 to 2014, Russia underwent one of these dramatic, defense reviews. They reorganized their military. They went back to these tank armies, these operational mobile groups. They began to practice offensive war. They re-equipped themselves, new communication, new uniforms, new everything. That's why in 2014, when the Russians went into Crimea, the whole world woke up and went, whoa, what just happened here? The little green men. You've heard about the little green men. Well, the little green men were all over Crimea, looking and acting like really professional troops. And the West went, there's something going on here. And then in 2014, as the Ukrainians tried to steamroll into Donbass, some Russian units got engaged, artillery units and army units, and they wiped the slate with the Ukrainians, just took them straight out. And again, NATO was like, this is impressive. And the Russians have only been getting better ever since. But again, they haven't done the large-scale offensive operations. What's happening now, there's an outstanding trilogy written by Rick Atkinson about the U.S. Army in World War II. And I see so many parallels between the story he tells from North Africa up until D-Day and then moving into Berlin and what's happening with the Russians right now. The Russians are becoming a professional, offensively oriented military that does war better than anybody on this planet. Doesn't mean they're perfect. They do war. And doing war means you take your lumps, you absorb them, you adapt, you move on. There's no such thing as the perfect military machine where everything runs right. But the Russians right now have a system where they are adapting, they are learning. It's almost like artificial intelligence. They're just sitting there learning and keep learning.
I want you to repeat what you just said about what the Russians are becoming. I want to make sure I heard it correctly, Scott. Have they become the best offensive ground military in the world?
Today, yes, because the U.S. has lost it. There was a time when, what the U.S. did in Iraq, both in 1991, 2003, that's offensive warfare. That's putting a large amount of tanks, armor, moving the logistics. Oh, we can't do that today. We forgot how to do it because of Afghanistan and the counterinsurgency conflict in Iraq. We broke our military. So we're no longer on the playing field. The Russians weren't on the playing field, but they're now on it, and they are learning how to do this. The proof will be in the pudding. When 8,000 troops show up on the battlefield, we'll find out if they can take theory and make it reality. But right now, they're better than the conversation.